All right. We're here with James Joyce's short story, Araby. And we've been sort of working through literary analysis, working through this framework. The whole point of literary analysis is to break apart the pieces of a piece of literature, look at each piece on its own, and then try and put them all back together to form a general understanding of the work as a whole. And so we've sort of been working our way down, and we're at that bottom layer now. And what we're going to look at today is figurative language and symbol. These are a little bit easier to pick out if you've had any sort of background in understanding them. And that is to say that they kind of leap out of the page at you if you haven't thought about the other things you can look for in literary analysis. So when we're talking about figurative language, we're really concerned mostly with metaphorical language. You might have been taught in school that, simile and metaphor are different. Similes use like and as, and metaphors don't. And that's totally true. But really, it's sort of like a square and a rectangle kind of a thing. Like a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square. Is that how that works? So all similes are actually metaphors. And so you just want to look for any type of metaphorical language, because this can also extend to allegory or analogy as well, which are sort of extended types of metaphors. So an allegory is when you are almost reaching larger than your story itself. A really famous allegory is the Crucible. It's about the Salem witch trials, but it's not really about the Salem witch trials. It's actually hiding another story underneath. So the entire work of the Crucible is just really a metaphor for what happens when you don't look at facts and you just sort of jump on the bandwagon and accuse people of things. So that's almost like an extended metaphor. And an analogy works in the same way too. That's when you're comparing two situations or two larger ideas, versus a metaphor might be contained, to a sentence, or an extended metaphor contained to a small section. So you're looking for any kind of metaphorical language. When you're dealing with literature, you don't need to find things like the onomatopoeias, and even things like alliterations aren't going to be super important here. You're looking for just metaphorical language, and even personification and things like that are going to fall to the wayside. They're not as important. You want metaphor. You want those ways that authors connect ideas to you without just saying them outright. It's how an artist sort of beautifully paints the tree instead of just taking you outside and saying that's a tree. And that's sort of the way that symbol functions as well. This thing that's being written about represents something else. So it's metaphorical in that way. So that's what you really want to look for, is any kind of metaphorical language. So we're just going to look at a really quick section today and talk about figurative language and symbol. So remember, he's at the bazaar, and he's just approached one of the stalls. They asked him, "Do you want to buy anything?" And he says, "No, thank you." The young lady changed the position of one of the vases and went back to the two young men. They began to talk of the same subject. Once or twice, the young lady glanced at me over her shoulder. I lingered before her stall, though I knew my stay was useless, to make my interest in her wares seem more real. Then I turned away slowly and walked down the middle of the bazaar. I allowed the 2 pennies to fall against the 6pence in my pocket. I heard a voice call from one end of the gallery. The light was out. The upper part of the hall was now completely dark. Gazing up into the darkness, I saw myself as a creature, driven and derided by vanity. My eyes burned with anguish and anger. So again, it's not really important if you know all the fancy words and terminology. You're just looking for metaphors here. You're looking for things that seem to represent something other than themselves. So he can feel the pennies clanking against the sixpence in his pocket. You know, the phrase, money burning a hole in your pocket. And that's kind of what's happening here. He has the weight of this money he wants to spend, and he's finally there. He finally has that moment where he can buy something for Megan's sister. He can do the thing that he wanted to do, he promised to do. And when he gets there, the hall goes dark. It's almost as if this is a symbolic itself. The darkness is symbolic itself. What he saw as this beacon of light, you know, he gets off the train, he sees the bazaar's name in lights, he walks in, he thinks it's going to be amazing, and it's gone dark. You know, it almost represents how when you take a really good look at things and you realize that they're not as beautiful as they might have seemed, and it's a facade for what's underneath. And then when he's talking about himself, he says that he sees himself as a creature. And you might be like, that's a simile. You're right. It's metaphorical language. He sees himself as a creature. Now, the connotation of creature has a connotation maybe of a monster or an animal. You know, he sees himself as inhuman. And he tells us it's because he sees himself driven by vanity. So he's being driven by this desire for beauty and for looking good and wanting people to look at him a certain way. And like that has consumed him. He has become different from who he really is. And he says that his eyes burned with anguish and anger. And his eyes aren't really burning. They're not really burning. You know, they're not really on fire. And so this is metaphorical language here. This is a metaphor. His eyes are burning with anguish and anger. Well, what might actually be happening if your eyes are burning with anguish and anger? You might be tearing up. They might be stinging. You know, when you have that tear where your eyes are stinging because of your crying, that might be what's happening here. They're burning with anguish and anger. He finally sees the truth only when he's in darkness. So we have this sort of beautiful metaphor here that sometimes you can only see what's really happening when you can't see it all. And when you have to face yourself, because you can't see anything else. When you're in the darkness, when you're in your own mind thinking about things, and it finally becomes light and you realize what you've done. And he realizes here in anguish and anger that he's been driven by vanity. He's been driven by something that's not really a true desire, and that he's become consumed by it. And so notice as I'm talking about this, you know, we don't have perfect metaphors here. We have really a good one at the end, but you know, we don't have the darkness was like a swamp. You know, it's not perfectly set up as a metaphor, because literature's not going to be perfectly set up like that all the time. What you want to be looking for is those larger things that it's saying without saying them. How is it metaphorically, so not explicitly, but implying something here? And that's what we're looking for. And so the motifs of eyes and darkness and brightness and light are really common things that are used as metaphors, and they're being used here in that way. What does it mean to finally be able to see the truth and see what's really going on? Sometimes you have to not see it all and be in the darkness to actually find out. So that's where we're going to stop for figurative language and symbol. And then we're going to have one more, I believe, where we're going to wrap everything up. We're going to read the end of the text, and we're going to talk about theme.